I had 11 months left before my pension cleared, and I meant to spend every one of them exactly the way I'd spent the last 30 years. Walking the freight rows of Kestrel Terminal with a flashlight and a clipboard, checking seals on containers nobody else wanted to check. It was quiet work. Nobody thanked you for it. That was fine by me. I found her on a Tuesday, behind a stack of grain crates that had come in from the outer settlements. She was pressed into the shadow so tight, I nearly logged the row as empty and moved on. Then the light caught her, and I understood why she was hiding. She was pale, not the milk white of a sick animal, but a true, deep pallor, scales the color of old bone from her snout to the tip of her tail, with only the faintest blush of rose along the ridges of her wings. She was small, barely the length of my arm, and when she saw me, she didn't hiss or snap. She flattened herself further into the crates, wings folded tight, claws hooked into the packing straw, and made a sound low in her throat that I'd never heard from a dragon before. Not a growl, something closer to an apology. I'd worked this terminal long enough to know dragons came through in cargo now and then. Traders, couriers, the occasional diplomatic escort. I'd never seen one abandoned. I set my clipboard down slow, crouched to her level, and said the only thing that came to mind. Nobody's going to hurt you on my watch. She didn't believe me. Why would she? But she didn't run either. I brought her scraps that first night. Dried fish from my own supper, since I didn't know what else a runt her size would take. She ate like she hadn't eaten in days, which I suspected was close to true. I found her a corner behind the old inspection shed, out of the wind, and I told myself I'd report her to Terminal Authority in the morning. I didn't. I told myself the same thing the next morning, and the one after that. By the end of the first week, I'd stopped pretending I meant to. Her name, I decided, ought to be something plain, since plain was what she seemed to want most in the world. I called her Ivory. She answered to it faster than I expected, turning her narrow head at the sound, like she'd been waiting for someone to give her a word that wasn't an insult. Because that's what I came to understand, over the slow accumulation of evenings. Somewhere, in whatever brood she'd hatched into, her color had been treated as a fault. She flinched when I raised my hand too quickly, even to hand her food. She wouldn't unfurl her wings all the way, like she'd learned it was safer to look smaller than she was. I've buried a wife and raised 2 children in this life, and I know the shape grief and fear leave on a face, animal or otherwise. Ivory wore both. I never asked her to explain herself. I don't speak dragon tongue, and she didn't offer the long clicking cadence some of the trade dragons use when they want humans to understand them. She just sat with me, some nights, her head resting against my boot, while I ate my own supper on an overturned crate, and let the quiet do what quiet does for creatures that have had enough noise. Word got around the terminal, the way it does in a place where 40 men and women work the same rows for decades. A dock supervisor named Priya asked me once, not unkindly, if I meant to keep a dragon the way some men kept a stray dog. I told her I didn't mean to keep anything. I meant to make sure something small didn't starve on my watch, and if that turned into keeping her, I'd deal with the paperwork when someone made me. Nobody made me. I think, in the end, more than one set of eyes in that yard were quietly glad Ivory had a place to be small in. She grew braver as the weeks passed, in increments so slow, I only noticed them in hindsight. The first time she unfurled her wings to their full span, she did it at 2 in the morning, when she thought I was asleep on my crate, stretching them out under the terminal floodlights, like she was testing whether the world would still let her take up that much space. I watched through half-closed eyes and said nothing, because some things a creature needs to do without an audience, even a friendly one. 3 weeks in, my knees told me plainer than usual that 30 years of walking concrete rows had cost me something I wasn't getting back. I sat longer than I meant to one evening, and Ivory noticed. She shuffled closer, curled her tail around my boots like a cat might, and huffed out a small breath of warm air across my hands. It wasn't much. It was the first thing she'd ever offered me instead of the other way around. and I'll admit it did something to my chest I hadn't expected at my age. I should say now, I never once thought she was anything but what she looked like. A runt. Discarded, likely, by a brood that couldn't see past her color to whatever else she might be. I fed her, because feeding a hungry thing in front of you is not a decision, it's a reflex, and I'd rather keep that reflex than lose it. I never thought about hierarchies or bloodlines or empires. I thought about getting her through another cold night without losing 3 fingers to frostbite on rounds that weren't paying me any extra to notice her. The convoy came on a morning in late autumn, and I knew from the hush that fell over the terminal before I even saw them that something had shifted. 6 dragons, adult, dark-scaled, moving in formation with a precision that had nothing frantic in it. No hunting posture, no bared teeth. They didn't come in low or fast. They came the way you'd approach a place you already suspected held something precious and didn't want to spook. At their head flew a dragon I later learned was Martial Regent Corin Thale, wingspan easily 4 times Ivory's, scales the deep slate of a storm cloud, old scars threading his flank like a map of a long service. He landed in the yard without a sound, which for something his size should have been impossible, and he did not look at me first. He looked past me, to the shed, where Ivory had gone rigid against my leg. Ilyera, he said, not a command, a name, spoken like a held breath finally let go. Ivory, Ilyera, didn't run to him. She looked up at me first, uncertain. The same look she'd worn the night I found her, like she needed permission to want something good. I put a hand on her head and told her to go on, and she went. Slow at first, then faster, until she was pressed against the Martial Regent's foreleg, the way she'd pressed against my boot on cold nights. It was Thale who told me, in the clipped, careful common tongue the diplomatic dragons use, that Ilyera was the Empress Solvain's youngest daughter, that her pallor, rare in the Halvern line, had been seized on by a faction within the court as an omen unfit for succession, and that in the chaos of a contested season, someone had tried to see that omen quietly erased. She'd been smuggled out in a grain shipment by a groundskeeper loyal to the old Empress, meant for safekeeping with kin, 2 terminals over. The shipment had been misrouted. Ilyera had simply survived the mistake, alone, until a man with a flashlight and a clipboard found her behind the crates. I want to say I felt something grand in that moment. Mostly I felt tired and a little sad, the way you do when something you'd gotten used to having nearby is about to belong, rightfully, somewhere else. Thale must have read that on me, because before he lifted off he did something I hadn't expected from a creature built like a battleship. He lowered his head, level with mine, and held it there a long moment. Not a bow, not quite, but close enough to one that the terminal workers who'd gathered at a careful distance went dead silent. The Empress will want to know your name, he said, and I suspect she'll want you to visit. I told him my name was Harlan Price, freight inspector, 11 months from retirement, and that visiting sounded fine, so long as it didn't interfere with my rounds. Ilyera looked back at me once, before they lifted into the gray morning sky, and I lifted my hand, the same plain gesture I'd have given anyone leaving on good terms. She didn't cry out. She didn't need to. I understood. The way you understand things, you've earned the right to understand slowly, that some kindnesses don't ask to be paid back, and get paid back anyway. I finished my rounds that day, walked the same rows, checked the same seals, same clipboard, same flashlight, but I noticed, for the first time in 30 years, that the quiet in that yard didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something had been kept safe in it, once, and left its shape behind.